So today we're studying Messiah in the life of Joshua, and this is going to be a really excellent study. We saw how Messiah was represented in the life of Moses in just amazing ways, and we also saw last week how important that verse was that Moses has said that there's going to be raised up a prophet from among his brethren, right? And how the three monotheistic religions are all kind of laying claim to that verse, but without a doubt Christianity has overwhelming evidence that that's Jesus Christ who ends up being the prophet, right? As we move into Joshua, even though Moses is a Messiah type, when you look at Joshua as a Messiah type, Moses kind of takes on a different type of symbology. You have to think of Moses, how is Moses in relation to Joshua in order to interpret the symbols? Okay? So like previously, where we looked at Moses specifically and all the events that were happening around him, okay, we were easily able to grab out things and say, wow, he's an exact Messiah type, okay? But when we look at Moses in relation to Joshua, he's not a Messiah type. And in this case, he has a different type of imagery, okay? So I just want to lay that out for you because we spent an hour or 45 minutes last week talking about how Moses was such an excellent Messiah type in the Old Testament. And now we're going to take him and not make him a Messiah type. And yes, he can be both. Okay? So, just wanted to kind of preempt that for you. All right? So, this book, we'll spend most of our time in the book of Joshua. Okay? And this begins the second division of the Old Testament, which is the history books. It's 12 books that closes on Esther, and so it deals with the history of the people of God. Okay, there's two primary themes in the book of Joshua. First theme that we're going to look at is that God had made a lot of promises to Israel. Okay, but they weren't yet fulfilled. Right? They were becoming fulfilled in Moses in that he brought him out of Egypt. He had mentioned that you're going to go into slavery in Egypt and then I'm going to bring you out, right? But all the promises about the promised land, none of those were fulfilled in Moses. Not a single one of them, right? But all of those were fulfilled in Joshua. So Joshua, the very first theme is that God had made these promises and they were made all the way back to Abraham. You know, so this was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that this went by without God's promises being fulfilled. And then Joshua comes on the scene, and he's the one that leads them into the promised land, and that's where these promises become fulfilled, right? So the first theme is about fulfilled promises. A second theme that is in Joshua is about fulfilled promises in the remote future. This actually begins in Genesis 3:15, where God pronounces that Satan's head will be bruised, and yet he will bruise the heel of the Messiah, right? Seed of the woman. Seed of the woman, exactly. And then, of course, it's talked about again in Genesis 22, when God spares, God will provide the lamb, and the whole thing with Isaac. The whole scene with Isaac is done, right? So there's two aspects of this. There's Joshua fulfilling promises, that they are fulfilled, and then there's the future that will be fulfilled. An overview, we'll primarily be looking at the very first chapters in Joshua. And in fact, we'll probably only make it to probably the victories in the land, okay? But all of these, as we look at Messiah in the life of Joshua, there's so much here that also relates to the Christian life or the church, and the church's relationship with Messiah and how they gain their promises. So we're going to look at the entire picture of that as we go through several of these stories. And it's been my goal, in teaching these classes, when we taught about the feasts and the customs of the Jews and teaching about the Messiah and the lives and the prophets and the patriarchs, is that kind of equipping you with a mindset that as you read through the stories of the Old Testament, that you can bring in your New Testament understandings into that and then pull out the full meaning and content of what God is trying to portray to you. Because we really think so much in images. And that's why God, I think, uses images, and most of the images that you get are out of the Old Testament. And even Paul, in many of his writings in the New Testament, will use those images from the Old Testament to reaffirm them, or he even almost sets them up as like Bible studies. Like if you look at Galatians chapter 4, with the analogy of the woman and throwing out the woman, the seed and the seed of the woman. So we'll begin with Joshua's name. Joshua's name was actually, in the Hebrew, it's Yehoshua or Yeshua. Okay? If anybody has ever studied Jesus' name in the Hebrew, it's also Yeshua. So Joshua was given his name by Moses, and this happened in Numbers chapter 13 to 16. This was right before he had sent the 12 spies out. Okay, so he picked out one the head member from each tribe, and he said, "Go out and spy the land." And they were told to go out and really kind of look at the land and see how great of a land it was. They kind of took it into a different place, though. They went out and they looked at the land, and they looked at the walls of Jericho and the men of Jericho, and they saw that they were giants and they were scared, and they were looking at it from the aspect of, can we actually conquer these people? Rather, they were supposed to go out and just say, wow, look at all the stuff that God has promised us. So, but right before Moses sends them out, and they name all of the people off in Numbers chapter 13, at the very last verse, he says that Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Joshua. Moses renamed Joshua to Joshua. So what he did was he put the Y in front of his name. And when you look at the Hebrew on that, the whole idea of that was, at least this is what the people who study Hebrew kind of believe, is that he was trying to impress into Joshua that Yahweh is going to lead the way. So he took the first letter of Yahweh and he put that as a prefix onto his name. And it says in the Talmud, under this notation, Sota 34b, that Moses foresaw the treachery and the faithlessness of the spies, and therefore he appended the Yod to remind Hoshea that Yahweh must come first. It also has a prophetic understanding because Joshua, who was the successor of Moses, would really become the salvation to the Jewish people. He would be their salvation. He would be the one that would help deliver them into the promised land. What's interesting is that if you go into the Greek Septuagint, this word right here in the Greek is Iesus, right? And everywhere that the word is written in the New Testament, now the Septuagint is the Old Testament written in Greek, okay? Everywhere in the New Testament, Iesus is used for Jesus. So the exact same name in the Septuagint is the exact same name that's used for Jesus in the New Testament. Iesus right here. That's the Greek to it. Another interesting aspect, if you read that verse, he is Hoshea, the son of Nun. It's interesting to note that the Talmud notes that the word Nun means fish, which was a symbol of activity in life. And the first mention of this is found in Exodus 33:11 when he's referring to Joshua. And one application of note here is that the one who succeeded Moses was able to bring them into the promised land was the Son of Life, a clear picture of Jesus, Yeshua, our Messiah, who by the same name. Another interesting note is that in the New Testament, fish features prominently with Jesus' ministry, with the disciples, and with Christianity. Jesus said to become fishers of men. Many of his disciples were fishermen. He had the multiplying of the fish and the loaves. He had the miracle of the fish. I mean, just one fish story after another, right? And not only that, fish became so synonymous with Christianity in the first century that it actually became a symbol of Christianity for actually a couple of centuries after that. That's why when you see today with the sign of the fish, that everybody knows that's a Christian symbol. That comes from the first century. So, under Joshua, the believers could enter into the rest of the promised land. So God's purpose was not only to deliver them out of Egypt, but then to deliver Egypt out of them. And that delivering the Egypt out of them took a lot longer than delivering them out of Egypt, as we know. It took 40 years in the desert. And in fact, the first generation wasn't even able to enter the promised land except for Joshua and who's the other one? Forgetting his name. Give me a Caleb. Thank you. Joshua and Caleb. So Canaan doesn't represent heaven. A lot of times people think Canaan represents heaven. Actually, in my mind, Canaan represents earth. Right? Because here we are on this earth. And what you're going to see is you're going to see a real parallel between your Christian walk and what ends up happening with Joshua. Your Christian walk with Christ and what ends up happening with the children of Israel with Joshua. Okay? Because in heaven, we're not going to battle all the Canaanites or all the unbelievers. Okay? When we get into heaven, that's a final rest. You understand? But there was a lot of work to do when people got into Canaan under Joshua. Okay? And there's a lot of work to do in this world under Jesus, while the church continues to battle the gates of hell. But the gates of hell will not prevail, right? As we know from Matthew chapter 16. So God has more in store for us than just saving us from the penalty of sin. He's giving us victory. You know, read the book of Joshua and realize that the book of Joshua is a picture of your Christian victory of walking in this life. Everything about that book is victorious. In fact, Joshua wins every single battle that he fights except for one battle. That's right. And that was the battle of Ai because of the sin of Achan. Right? Yeah. What had happened, I think most of you know, but just in case you don't, that one person had disregarded the word of God and had taken booty out of that battle, out of a previous battle, I think it was Jericho actually, and had hid it underneath of his tent. And so they went to go fight against a really small town, and they lost. And they were real sore distressed about it because they really needed to put fear in the people of the land because they didn't want to build up their confidence against them. Every person in the land of Canaan was ready to wipe out Israel, or wanted to, but they were scared of them. But this showed, hey, wait a second, maybe they can be wiped out. So it was a serious issue. But they ended up, they found the situation, God judged them, and they repented, and then after that they won every single battle. Not only did they win battle against single kings, but they took on multitude of kings at times. Sometimes 5 kings, and they beat them. This is the same group of people who wandered the wilderness for 40 years and lost almost every battle they fought. So in the book of Exodus, you have in the books of Exodus, you have a people who are constantly, they're losing battles, okay? They're doing wrong things. They're moaning and groaning and complaining against Moses and against God, okay? Right. They're building idols, and then they're repenting, and they last for like a minute, and then right back into the fall again. And you're constantly seeing failure in the book of Exodus. But what do you see in the book of Joshua? Is you see victory everywhere, right?
Because
and that's what
together the nation.
And, well, what we need to understand is why are we seeing that victory, and that's the key to the study.
Right.
So Moses couldn't lead them into the promised land. The book of Joshua begins with Moses dying, and then Joshua taking charge of the group. And what Moses ends up representing for us, as I told you, the typology of Moses changes when you look at him in relationship to Joshua, right? Moses ends up representing the law. And Joshua ends up representing faith, right? You have the law, the people of the law, and the people of faith. The first generation under Moses could not enter the promised land.
Right.
They didn't have faith. They tried to assume righteousness through the flesh, but that was impossible, and they failed every time they tried, right? But in Joshua, you see a people of faith, and they're victorious, and they follow Joshua, right? For what the law could not do, in that it was weak in the flesh, God sent his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, to condemn sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. And that's what you see in Joshua. So Moses also died. So it's interesting that it's interesting that Moses has that situation where he hits the rock, at the end there, and he's not allowed to enter the promised land.
Right.
Because it also fits into the whole typology that Moses, being the lawgiver, okay, and that we couldn't find righteousness through the law, right? But the law was given to us as a taskmaster, that the lawgiver was not the one to enter into the promised land or to bring the people into the promised land, but it was Joshua. In fact, the people of the flesh had to die. In Hebrews chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, there's an interesting verse. There's interesting verses there, and I'm going to touch on those because the author of the book of Hebrews is doing what we talked about earlier, where he's bringing out the symbology of the Old Testament and applying that to New Testament understanding for us. And specifically, Joshua and what was going on with Moses and Joshua. So it pertains to our study, right? Take care, brothers, lest there be an evil, unbelieving heart leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort each other, or exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by deceitfulness of sin. For we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end. As it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion. For those who heard and yet rebelled. For who are those who heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all who left Egypt who were led by Moses? And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that we are unable to enter because of unbelief. And if you go, and he expounds on that a little further in the verses, but we're going to jump now to Hebrews 4, verses 1 to 3. Therefore, while promise of entering into this rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For the good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united in faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest. As it is said, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my wrath. They shall not enter my wrath. We have entered into the rest. They shall not enter his rest. They have entered into the wrath. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. God had finished his works, but they had to enter into it. Again, he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward in words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So this is not only talking about the past and how that pertains to your Christian life, but it's also talking about the future of your Christian life, right? Or where you are at today, right? Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. It's not by the works of the flesh, right? It's by faith in God, right? So your resting is in your works, right? So then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. So you can see that how the author of the book of Hebrews is showing for you that there's this parallelism between Joshua and Jesus. However, even though it talks about entering into his rest, going into the promised land, we know that that rest was not completely fulfilled, in that David, who was alive many years later, talks about entering into his rest, right? And that it's ultimately fulfilled through Jesus. This goes back to my explanation about being saved, right? That there's a definitive time to being saved, a progressive time, and an ultimate time. The definitive time is when you're born again. The progressive time is your sanctification, when you're yielding your will to Christ. And then there's the ultimate payment when we die and we receive our resurrection bodies. So, the author of Hebrews likens this unbelief, those people who reject the gospel, and they fail to gain the rest of salvation. So just as Joshua is the one that's able to lead them into the promised land, Jesus is the one who's leading us into our salvation too, right? All right, comparing the Israel of the wilderness with the Israel of the promised land, okay? In the wilderness, as I said, Israel was a defeated nation. After refusing to go up into the promised land, remember the 12 spies? They said, they look like giants. We can't go up there. We will lose. Okay? It was only Caleb and Joshua who said, you know what? God has given this into our hands. Let's go. Well, you know, the 10 spies were saying that, you know, they're giants and it's fortified cities. Let's think about that for a second, okay? Israel hadn't, you know, really been set themselves up as a major army at this time. They had some weapons. They had fought some battles. They hadn't really fought against these types of fortified cities. Okay? They didn't have battering rams. They didn't have siege platforms. They didn't have any of those things. And this is one of the most fortified cities in the land. Yeah. And they're going up against it right off the bat. Yeah. So what they're saying is pretty, from your eyes, sure looks like that, you know? Well, when Moses told the words to the people mourned greatly. Okay, so what ends up happening is this, okay? When right after that, I think I actually have the verses, I pull them out later here, but right after that, you know, the people say, you know what, we're not going up. You know, this is ridiculous. This is a stupid fight. We're not going to do it. We believe the 10 spies and not the 2, right? Right. And then God gets really upset, okay? And the people are actually getting ready to stone Joshua and Caleb, right? But the only reason they don't get stoned is because God shows up at the tent, shows up in image. That's the only reason they didn't get stoned. And he says, you know what? None of you guys are going to enter the promised land except for Caleb and Joshua. And I just realized something there too. Moses' name's omitted. You know that? I mean, this is before, I think this was before Moses hit the rock, right? So it's kind of like prophetic when you think about it, right? I didn't think about that till just now. Anyhow, so after this, when Moses told them these words, the people mourned greatly. And then they rose early in the morning and they went up to the heights of the hill and they said, here we are. We will go up to the land that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. So they said, you know what? God told them, said, don't go up. I'm not with you. And then they who have been living according to their flesh rise up early in the morning and says, we're ready to go up. We're going to win this battle. Moses says, why are you transgressing the command of the Lord? Well, what's the command of the Lord? The command of the Lord is don't go up and wander the wilderness now for 40 years, right? And they say, no, we're not going to do that. First, God says, go take the land, it's yours. And they say, no, we're not going to do that. Then God says, don't take the land, it's not yours. They say, no, we're not going to do that either. You know, it's funny how the flesh is always at war with God. It's always going to do the opposite, isn't it? Kind of sounds like. He says, for we have sinned. Moses says, okay, you're already he says, you won't succeed. He says, don't go up. The Lord isn't among you, lest you be struck down by your enemies. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites are facing you, and you shall fall by the sword, because you have turned back from following the Lord. The Lord isn't with you. But they still presume to go up to the heights of the hill country, although neither the Ark of the Covenant, nor the Lord, nor Moses departed out of the camp. They said, you know what? God or no God, we're going up. I'm not wandering the wilderness for 40 years. That's a terrible judgment. Might as well go ahead and go up. Well, the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in the hill country came down and defeated them and pursued them even to Hormah. What's fascinating that word Hormah is used. If you look up the word Hormah, you're going to see that was later conquered by Joshua and allotted to Judah. So this exact same group of people who could not win that battle, right, later ended up conquering them, plus conquering where they ended up running to, which was Hormah, under Joshua. Can win all kinds of victories through faith. We can lose all kinds of victories, lose all kinds of battles through the flesh. So in Canaan, they were easily able to overcome their foes. They only lost one battle. Once again, that was unconfessed sin. There's and to really draw that out, the sin of Achan and realize what unconfessed sin can mean in the Christian life, I'll leave that to you. Okay? Read about it and meditate on it and see what God says to you about unconfessed sin. But other than that, the entire book of Joshua is a book of victories. So, to overview many of the similarities between Joshua and faith, and Moses and the law, and Joshua and Jesus, we'll just touch on them really quickly. Moses was a picture of the law, and Joshua is a picture of faith. And then many times in the New Testament, it's talked about how the law doesn't give you the ability to be saved. It's a taskmaster. It's a mirror. It's a mirror for you to look into to say, like, I am guilty. Guilty as charged. So Moses pictures the law, and he was the lawgiver. He was not able to enter the promised land, but Joshua was able to enter the promised land and to lead his people into the promised land. Joshua was a servant who obeyed the law. When Jesus came to this earth, and we noticed this in our previous study in the Feast of the Customs of the Jews, right? Mm-hmm. He obeyed every single custom of the Jews. That's right. Well, I'm sorry. He obeyed every single feast of the Jews and most of the customs. Some of the customs were the traditions of men that specifically went against God's words, and those ones he threw out. He was a perfect Jew.
Correct.
Of the Old Testament, because he had to honor that in order to become our righteousness.
Right, because Matthew chapter 10 verse 5 says, go not unto the land, of the Samaritans, and all of that. So he came to fulfill the promises of the fathers.
Perfect. He was subject to the law, and he fulfilled the law. Mm-hmm. So he's the only one. Joshua was devoted to his spiritual father. Everywhere you look in the book of Exodus, you see that Joshua is Moses' right-hand man. He's completely devoted to God's will. You only see, he's completely devoted to God's will, and he's like Moses' right-hand man. He's the person that Moses can trust the most, right? And Moses, in a way, represents Joshua's spiritual father. And of course, who's Jesus' spiritual father, or his actual father? But he's a spiritual father because God is spirit, right? Anyhow, John 6:38, Jesus continued and was totally devoted to the will of the Father. Joshua was willing to fight God, or willing to follow God, despite any types of adversity and people's opinions. As I mentioned, when he was sent out as one of the 12 spies, and he said, we can take the land, the people got so angry with him. It's in Numbers chapter 14, 10 to 12. Then all the congregation said to stone them with stones. But the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of the meeting to all the people of Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people despise me, and how long will they not believe in me? In spite of all the signs I have done among them, I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they. Well, Moses interceded for the nation, otherwise it would have been a whole thing of starting the nation completely over with Moses and Joshua and Caleb, right? Yeah. So thankful for that. But it's interesting that, Jesus also had those times when he had to speak the truth of God's word, and they wanted to stone him as well, right? But he remained steadfast. And not only that, we also see in Mark chapter 14, verses 50 to 52, where he was completely abandoned. He didn't even have a Caleb with him or a Moses, but the last of his disciples ran away wearing only a linen cloth until somebody grabbed the linen cloth, and he ran away naked. So couldn't get away from him fast enough. Joshua was the commander of the armies, and we know that Jesus is the Lord of lords and the host of hosts. The host of hosts means the host of armies. The Lord of hosts is the Lord of armies. And Joshua is the commander of the army. So Joshua led his Israel into the promised land. And obviously Christ leads us into the promised land. Joshua is a mighty conqueror. And Jesus defeated Satan, the king of evil, conquered sin, which is considered a tyrant, and rules over the sons of men. And he also conquered death, the king of terrors. So he fulfilled promises of God. All the promises of God's elect are fulfilled in Lord Jesus. He's able to subdue all things to himself. He's able to keep that which was committed to him. He's able to save to the uttermost. He's able to keep those from falling and present us as faultless in the presence of his glory. Joshua also thrived in God's presence. Every time there's tabernacle, or all these times when the tabernacle, you see that Joshua's right there. And Jesus also made sure that he spent time in God's presence. Another thing about Joshua is that there's very little negative stuff. There's a lot of stuff written about Joshua when you think about it. A lot of stuff, right? But there's only a couple of minor criticisms of Joshua in the Bible. One was in his youth when he took his zeal for God a little bit too far. That's in Numbers 11:27 to 29 if you want to see that. Once as a leader, he acted rashly. He didn't seek God first when the Gibeonites came to him and wanted to create a covenant, and they deceived him. So, but his perfection contrasts sharply with Moses' imperfections, because you see as a youth Moses committing murder, which is pretty serious. He didn't want to go and save the Israelites. He basically went there begrudgingly at first. God said, I'd almost talk him into it. And in the twilight of his career, hitting the rock. Joshua was faithful and merciful to Rahab, the harlot of her house. In Joshua chapter 2, Joshua sends 2 spies, and those 2 spies they find out that there's 2 spies in the land of Jericho. So the king sends to look for them. Rahab covers them up and says, hey, they took off. And she shows faith. She says, I know that the Lord has given this land, and fear has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land will melt from before you. So she confesses with her mouth and with her actions. Now, she can't confess that Jesus is Lord, and she can't confess that God raised him from the dead. Right. But as an Old Testament saint, she confesses. She's a believer.
Right.
And it says that anyone who believes in him shall not be put to shame. So what you see in here is you see amazing symbology of Rahab as us. We're Rahab, the harlot. Okay? And then speaking those truths about the truth of God and Joshua is where our deliverance comes from. What's also interesting too is that her house is sitting right there on the wall of Jericho, right? And they hang a scarlet thread down from that wall. Well, after Joshua's army marches around Jericho for 7 days, and then on the 7th day they march around 7 times, and then they blow the trumpet 7 times, right? And a loud shout. What happens to the wall of Jericho? Walls of Jericho come falling down, right? So anybody on the walls, what do you think happens to them? They're in bad shape. If they're not dead, they're hurting, right? But Rahab and her entire family was saved. So they were divinely protected. And the battle at the wall, the battle of the wall of Jericho, there's a lot of imagery that points into Revelation, which we're going to touch on maybe might not be able to get to it, but it's in the end of your notes.
Yeah,
Okay,
seven.
so there is, whether you're a post-tribulationist or a pre-tribulationist, as far as the rapture goes, if you're raptured before, then you're divinely protected. Even if you're a post-tribulationist, there is divine protection for Christians in the post-tribulation rapture view. So crossing the Jordan by faith. This is really fascinating. So the Jordan represents crossing from it's dying to yourself is what it really represents, the Jordan, right? So it's crossing from the old and into the new. It's crossing into the promised land. It's going into the covenant, right? And we see right after they cross into the Jordan that they initiate the circumcision, and they also have the Passover feast, which is also very fascinating when you look at how that works into Christology, right? And I'm going to ask you guys to go back and read these things and begin to tie these strings together for yourselves, because we don't have enough time to actually draw everything out. We could do an entire series on Joshua, which might be interesting to do, to draw them out. But so as they go over to the Jordan, it's the time of the flood. The Jordan's like overflowing in the banks because it's that time of the year. And so Joshua's looking, and he comes up with this idea, which I'm assuming it was divinely given to him, is that the priests are going to carry the Ark of the Covenant into the water. And as they carry the Ark of the Covenant into the water, all the people from behind, they have to look at the Ark of the Covenant. So they line up to where people can see it. Right? So the person in front of you can't be taller than you. Got to be able to see the Ark of the Covenant, right? So they look at the Ark of the Covenant. As the priests go into the water and their feet touch the water, God pulls the water all the way back to Adam. Okay? And the water is completely separated, just like at the Red Sea, right? So they walk across, and then they camp on the other side. And as they camp on the other side, Joshua says, take 12 stones out of the river and set them up as a memorial. And he says, then put 12 stones into the river and set them up. And what those 12 stones represent as a memorial, they were a memorial to what God has promised and how he's fulfilled those promises. So every time they saw those stones, they could remember that miracle and how God would fulfill those promises. But then also there's 12 stones that are in the river. And that represents the covering over of the sins, of all the past failures, that God doesn't see them anymore and we don't see them anymore. All the way back to Adam. So, as Joshua is surveying, got about 5 more minutes. Okay, so as Joshua is surveying Jericho, trying to come up with his battle plan, he meets, and we're going to talk about, we'll probably maybe draw some of this out when we do our theophany, which is the very last lesson in this series, okay? But he actually meets Jesus in the pre-incarnate Jesus in Joshua chapter 5. And he's holding a sword. And he says, have you come to be on our side, or are you on the other person's side? Because at first he doesn't recognize it. He says, no, I'm the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the armies. And he says, I haven't come to take part in your part, but I've come to take your place. And there's incredible imagery there. You know, it's God who fights our battles. We don't get him to help fight for us. We just get in line with him. Don't get him in line with you. You get in line with him. That's the key to that conversation right there. Mm-hmm. So as he's, it's interesting though that after he meets with him, that's when he comes back and he tells the people, this is what we're going to do. We're going to march around the city for 7 times, and we're going to, on the 7th day, we're going to march around it 7 times, and then we're going to blow the trumpet, and then there's going to be a moment of silence, and then we're going to shout, and the walls are going to come down. Because, you know, previous to that, Joshua was kind of surveying the cities. Probably, I'm assuming, thinking like, how am I going to get into this city, right? But God's given it to me, so. Here's the interesting things that kind of parallel the end times, right? Joshua is the commander who's going to dispose of usurpers, and Jesus Christ at his second coming does the same thing. There's this 7-year period. There's so many sevens in this, right? We have that you're going to march around it for 7 days, right? There's a 7-year period. We got the 7 out of the 10 nations. You have the, on the 7th day, you're going to march around it 7 times, and then you're going to blow the trumpets, right? 7s within 7s. At first, before they even go into this, they send their 2 witnesses, right? And that kind of marks the tribulation period where we have 2 witnesses in the book of Revelation who are telling people to repent. And even in the book of Revelation, there's that half-hour period of silence, which we also talked on the Day of Atonement, right? When the Lord opened its 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for a half hour. Underneath of that, I put out for you some specific verses for you to look at. Mm-hmm. So here's some other similarities between Joshua and Jesus. Joshua was given his name by his spiritual father. Jesus likewise was given his name by his spiritual father, by his father, the Holy Ghost, right? Mary was told, you should call him Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. So isn't that interesting? They were both descendants of Joseph. Joshua was a faithful companion, as we talked about. He was a commander of armies. He was truly humble with a great moral character. He loved the house of God. He's steadfast in his faith despite being rejected. He appointed 12 men. Jesus appointed 12 men. Both led God's people into the promised land. Both performed various miracles. One of the miracles I wanted to draw out was the fact that Joshua had told the sun to stand still. And of course, Jesus told the wind and the rain to stand still, right? You remember that? Mm-hmm. Even over the weather. Both were allotted the inheritance of the Lord to God's people. Both circumcised their people. Jesus circumcises us in the spirit, Colossians 2:11, Joshua at Gilgal, Joshua 5, verses 1 to 8. Both had married a Gentile bride. Okay, well, this isn't in the Bible. I thought I'd throw it in there because, according to the rabbis, Joshua ended up marrying Rahab. Take it or leave it. It's up to you, okay? So, the salvation by the scarlet cord. The scarlet cord represents the blood of Christ, right? It's red. We got the blood of Christ, right? Moses was the lawgiver. He was unable to give them rest unto salvation. That honor was given to Joshua. It's interesting. So in the Midrash, it says that Joshua was born and nobody even took note. But when he died, all Israel took note. Nonetheless, the Israels who did not mourn, they didn't mourn him properly. One was busy in his vineyard and the other was busy in his field, another with his colt. The Holy One, blessed he, and they're speaking about Joshua. This is from the Midrash, okay? Therefore sought to make the whole world quake. This is also an apt description of Yeshua, Jesus, Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering servant, whose birth went unnoticed, but his death and his resurrection indeed shook the whole world. Some final thoughts on victory as a Christian. In Joshua 1:8, the verse says, the book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that to be careful to do all according to is written in it, for then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Okay? So what it's basically saying in that verse, it says meditate on God's words. Think of God's words. Meditate on it, right? And it says say God's words. Use your mouth. Say God's words. And then it says do God's words. But you know what? You can't do God's words without meditating and saying it. What you're doing is you're putting that into you so that you can have it come out of you to do God's words. If you look carefully, it says so that you will be careful to do all that is according in it. It's not that you're going to do it by your strength in the flesh, but you're going to do it by your yielding in the spirit, right? And when you do that, that's when you become a victorious Christian. I didn't touch on all of the, going all the way back to the beginning here, all of the different overview focuses of this, but you can see in the failure of Achan, unconfessed sin, in the success of Achan, confessed sin, in the Gibeonite deception, you can see where the church aligns with the world, right? Remember, Satan has 2 ways that he wants to destroy God's people, right? One way is to just outright destroy them. Another way is to get them to assimilate, okay? And assimilation is where you lose your victory, right? So this Gibeonite deception is a picture of that assimilation. The sun standing still was Joshua's showing power even over the elements of the world. And the 5 Amorite kings that we didn't touch on, where Joshua defeated all of those kings, before he had them put to death, okay, he brought the people of the children of Israel, and he had every one of them step on the necks of those kings. And that demonstrates your victory in the spirit over sin and over Satan in this world, as long as you are following Joshua, as long as you are following Jesus. Okay? So awesome pictures there. Pictures that you can really take and apply into your life as a Christian.